So, greetings to our dear viewers. So, I'm really assuming that you're interested in the profound topic of social inequality. Well, social inequality, like this iceberg right here, has more than what meets the eye. If one has a shallow understanding of it, one could fall into the dogma of having tedious, repetitive, and quite vague arguments and perceptions which wouldn't really work for policies. But if one understands it deeper, it's actually quite rich and profound. You would realize that making everything equal isn't really the goal, but to make everything as fair as possible. And quite possibly, you would get to understand why it's sometimes okay not to be the richest guy in the room, or why you should continue to work for your dreams regardless of failure. A perspective from sociology could actually give you a lens that would better understand social workings by seeing them as some sort of unnatural and unfamiliar, some sort of a sociological perspective. So without further ado, let's head on in. Oops, okay. So social and political stratification in the sociological perspective. So society is composed of different individuals who possess different characteristics and are born in different circumstances. Thus, they have different attributes as well as different levels of power, wealth, and prestige. This could have adverse effects on the equality of members of society and is one of the most profound effects of social inequality actually. Social inequality is the heart of sociology. Well, social inequality can be said to be the heart of sociology. I mean, by pursuing it, the discipline is able to give face to social realities given birth by the various social force pushing people in all sorts of directions like stereotyping, discrimination, and the like. These social forces are so invisible and most of the time taken for granted. How? Well, people think that they're just natural, that social inequality is natural. The aura of being natural makes social inequality quite hard to criticize, at least as far as sociology is concerned. Well, the golden contribution, I would say, of sociology is to give it a face, give it a name, and give methodical ways to deal with social inequality in its aforementioned distinctions. So according to sociologists, its invisibility cloaks are due to its social constructedness, meaning that society dictates what should be considered important or not and through the process of socialization led members to believe that such is the ways of nature. But may I remind you that don't do this. In this lesson we will learn how most of the social workings that we see today are not innate or natural, but they are the products of human action. We will come to know why people act the way they act based on knowing what are the social desirables. So, what are the social desirables? Any rational individual in a human community will always aspire for things that bestow wealth, power, and prestige. And I didn't just state these three out of nowhere. We'll get to that later. Unfortunately, the ability of individuals to realize such aspirations is severely constrained by situations where one is born into. It is this context that shapes the identity of an individual, even as this also becomes the source of the constituents that may limit his or her potential to achieve an aspired social desirable. Some traits are difficult to alter and change, while others can be changed as one progresses towards adult life. And you earn the ability to make decisions and choices, obviously, in the adult life. Hence, some ascribed traits eventually yield to become achieved traits. So immediately you will be able to think that social inequality is not just natural, it's all not a natural innate process. It's also some sort of a product of human interaction. Anyways, so the manner by which one can have the ability to be in control of one's life to achieve social desirables, like wealth, power, and prestige, is a measure of how one is able to transcend the limitations provided the circumstances within which one is born. So, Inequalities among people are anchored on the presence of social desirables, which are defined as resources considered valuable by societies. The different sociological camps may focus on any of these resources as the basis of their theoretical perspective on social inequality. For Marxism, it is power and wealth, and for symbolic interactionism, it may be prestige due to some illustrious backgrounds, or maybe all illustrious backgrounds, eliciting some sort of respect, and therefore allowing better opportunities in society. If I was a PhD, I may have more credibility in saying this. That's just a brief example. So, in short, the recognition of the existence of these social desirables is what brings together the social camps. However, what makes them different is how they see these resources in relation to their availability and how they can be accessed by members of society. This is called their class status. So availability and accessibility are two different issues that need to be clarified at the onset as they define the core of inequality as a social issue. Availability refers to the presence, absence, or scarcity of the social desirables, while accessibility refers to the actual ways and means of availing the resources. Hence, the scarcer they are, the more difficult it is to access them. Traditionally, wealth, power, and prestige, so here we go, I'm going to explain what they are the three important social desirables, but they're not all the social desirables. They're just three from the social desirables. And generally, possession of them defines your social understanding, a reflection of your worth and your access with social, political, and symbolic capital. We'll get to this later, by the way. In other words, it's your class status. So, different sociologists have different ideas as to what constitutes social classes. Karl Marx looked at it in terms of wealth produced in relation to the ownership of the means of production. So for example, if you are the owner of the company and you get most of the profits gained by your company operation compared to that of your employees. So the wealth, by the way, may refer to money, properties, or any similar tangible resources. While Max Weber, on the other hand, differentiates them into three: wealth, power, and prestige. So he says that the individual's social standing can be measured all at once based on their relative access to these three. For example, a college professor may have less power and less wealth, but he or she enjoys a lot of prestige. A government employee may have less wealth and prestige, but he or she may have more power, for example. So the forms of capital and inequalities. The previous statements can be also assessed in terms of social resources. So in every society, some people have a greater share of valued resources like money, property, education, health, power, and others. Than others. Sorry. So these social resources can be divided into three forms of capital. The economic capital, which is in the form of material assets and income. The cultural capital, such as educational qualifications, and status. And the social capital in the form of networks of contacts and social associations, or specifically social knowledge and connection that enable you to accomplish their goals and extend their influence. Often these forms of capital overlap, and one can be converted into the other. That sound confusing, but for example, a person from a well-off family can maybe afford to buy an expensive higher education to acquire a cultural or educational capital. So the economic capital directly, effectively enhanced because of its translation to cultural capital. He was able to study because of his money actually, and then became a higher educational qualification. He had a higher educational qualification because of that. So the forms of capital and inequalities, sorry. So one of the most important aspirations of individuals in a society is to actually move outside the confines of the conditions of their birth. So this is evident in the issues of social classes. This is called social mobility. Social mobility, has been largely seen as the ability of someone to go up the social ladder or to break loose from the confines of a marginalized group. It is defined as the movement of individuals, families, households, or other categories of people within or between layers or tiers in an open system of social stratification. The movement, however, whether upward or downward, is dependent on the type of stratification present. These include sex, gender, race, ethnicity, and even age. Also, did you know that there is a kind of social mobility called structural mobility? So structural mobility. Structural mobility is a type of forced mobility, so it's quite compulsory, that results from a change in the distribution of all or many of the statuses within a society. While structural mobility can be upward mobility, it more often involves downward mobility simply because of the economic, social, and political turmoil these drastic changes cause. Now, now that we know this, we could better appreciate social inequality, which is, like I said, perceived to be the heart of sociology. So let's move on to social inequality. Social inequality. So social equality is good. So keep in mind I wrote social equality is good. It is in fact a desirable attributed trait in a democratic and civilized society. Unfortunately, as we are better attuned and well versed with the real world, we are able to recognize the sheer difficulty of achieving this, as there are just as many sources of inequality. First, there is inequality in the access of social, political, and symbolic capital. Social capital refers to the ability of a collective to act together to pursue a common goal. Relatively disorganized groups, therefore, like small brigades that don't have a coach or don't have a captain, due to lack of resources or time, would definitely fare worse in acting collectively compared with those who have resources to mobilize. The next type of capital is political capital. Political capital refers to the trust, goodwill, and influence possessed by a political actor, such as a politician, to mobilize support towards a preferred policy outcome. This amounts to the access one person has to his or her political representative, and the political literacy is also needed for them to be able to be in the same page and for them to function well together. So finally, we have symbolic capital, which refers to the resources that one possesses, which is a function of honor, prestige, or recognition, and any other trait that one values within the culture. It is an important possession that can influence someone to access opportunities in society. Unfortunately, this is mostly influenced by origin and other ascribed traits, which causes the marginalization of those with humble backgrounds. Aside from social class, gender and sexual orientation have been also victims of inequality. So, for example, women are often treated lowly in patriarchal cultural structures, okay, because these cultures see only men as the natural leaders. On a historical perspective, it is also important to note that women were allowed to vote much, 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 much later than men in some countries. Uh, that's a notable example in countries like United States, who had their history almost known by test takers worldwide. Then there's the case of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender LGBT persons. The group often is subjected to discrimination and ridicule by societies that consider them aberrations or forms of deviancy. So, members of the LGBT community struggle to win recognition for their civil rights, such as the right to marry in some countries. We also have ethnic minorities. Ethnic minorities are also subjected to discrimination, aside from cultural marginalization. They suffer from the dominant cultural majorities where their cultural practices are subjects of ridicule and their physical appearances and demeanor cause discrimination through stereotyping. They are also profoundly shaken by developmental aggression wherein ancestral lands are either forcibly taken away in guise of developmental projects or actually becoming dumping grounds for toxic wastes. And finally, we have the persons with disabilities. They are discriminated because of their impairments, which become basis to be denied equal opportunity in employment. So let's go on to the next slide. There are two ways by which social inequality can be addressed. First is through policy legislation. So gender equality can be fostered by legislating laws that promote the rights of women, the LGBT community, the ethnic minorities, and the PWDs. Currently, we have laws in the Philippines that promote the rights of women. However, there are none yet for the LGBT. Similarly, laws that protect the right of ethnic minorities can be improved. The Philippines has in place the Indigenous Peoples' Rights that seeks to protect the rights of indigenous communities. However, it is still grossly ignored and even abused by some um, unlawful people. So one prime example was the tragic and eventful case of the Lumad killings. These rights, beyond being ratified, need to be securely upheld, to engender care for human rights. So another way is through promoting cultural transformation and endeavoring to transform the way society looks at these marginalized sectors. So the key to this is the education of the public, both in formal avenues such as seminars and in informal means such as popular media. Through this, empathy and rational thought may be encultured, causing discrimination to be addressed and minimized, if not totally removed. So next one is the most substantive, thought-provoking, and controversial types of inequality right now. Okay. So it's global inequality. Unfortunately, inequality does not exist only in societies and states inside, but it also happens among those different states. So there are states that are wealthier and more powerful than other states, and the powerful ones end up being more influential in the global community. This leads to a situation of global inequality where poorer and less powerful states end up being controlled and influenced by the richer and more powerful states. So the balance of power is more often than not rooted in historical events, where the process of colonization in the past led to a relation of unequal dependency between a former colony and a former colonized country. For example, the Philippines and the United States. However, inequality can also become the outcome of the relative strength in terms of the strategic importance or the developmental resistance. An example is the resource-rich states, such as the oil-producing countries, tend to have more leverage. States that send official countries also tend to have more, that send official development resistance to other countries are also well positioned to dictate their policy conditions. But the most profound of all is military strength out of all of this, because it has become a prime source of inequality. For in some instances, countries are able to bully their way with other countries, such as the case of China invading the Philippine Sea. But luckily, there are mechanisms that can address social inequalities. Oh, there's a slide over there. So the most profound is the military strength has become a prime source of inequality because of the example. So it's self-evident in the picture right there. So luckily there are mechanisms that can address global inequalities. So one of this is the formation of regional groups. How would I say this? Okay, so the formation of regional groups such as the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So nothing much to explain there. Another venue is to enter into bilateral treaties and pacts with other countries. So a good example of this is the Mutual Defense Agreement of the United States and the Philippines. And finally, there is the recourse of international treaties and agreements. So a good use of this is beheld in the case where the Philippines filed and won the complaint against China in the International Court. However, each of these have their own conditions wherein it could aggravate social inequality by the need for the needing countries to comply with the policy of the helping countries. So if I help you, you need to comply with my terms and conditions. Simple business. So through this, it is evident that stratifications create all sorts of differences in treatment from ascribed and developed traits. So let's move on. So to inculcate the effect of this lesson, I would like you to do this activity. So I'll read it for you. To provoke your intellectual faculty on social norms, create a position paper on this question. Based on what you have learned from social inequality, is communism the right way to go? Ooh, spicy. You don't need to extensively cite, just present your arguments right. So I'll give you an hour to do that. So maybe you could pause the video and make your own arguments. Again, you don't have to extensively cite data, just present your arguments that are solid, state, explain, and illustrate that example. So you can just pause the video. Okay, so let's head on to the question and answer part. I assume that you have finished making the position paper, or if not, then let's just move on. Maybe this can help you. The question and answer part is created in order to oh wait, this is my opinion, by the way, on the activity. So communism is not the way to go because it provides too much pressure to the government in ensuring equality. So this is with basis to historical events because communism has historically failed numerous times. Ergo, equality should be an encouraged notion, not a forced one. You can't force people to have to have equal and redistributed resources. That just doesn't work out in the government standpoint. In fact, anything that's forced by the government, like the redistribution, anything economic like that, specifically redistribution is a hard job for the government. So okay, let's head into the question and answer part. So the question and answer part is made so that you could maybe have controversial questions that are spicy enough that I really like to answer. So I like spicy questions, by the way. So the question is inequality avoidable? If yes, how? If no, why are we still pursuing social inequality? Ooh, that's a real tough question. Okay, so is inequality avoidable? So both questions are infringing on their own rights, infringing on the arguments on their own rights. So my answer is no. But you don't confuse efficiency with callousness in the sense that you stop fighting for inequality because it isn't efficient. That's just plain laziness, and I don't think that's the right way to go. So if the reason why we pursue inequality, I mean quality, equality. Oh my gosh, equality. The reason why we pursue equality is because we need to constantly defend human rights because we're just going to go back again. We're going to backtrack all our development if our human rights get constantly violated. Now, how do I say this? So, for example, you're rich and people are entitled to. People get to say that they want your money because they want to have equal amounts of economy for all. Of course, it may sound like social inequality, but the Amendment of Human Rights states that you have the right to your own property, which defends you from that callous type of radicalist communism. So, no, don't confuse really efficiency for callousness. We need a lot of logic and policy making in order to make sure that human rights are properly defended. And I think that the human rights policies stand the way they are really effective in stipulating what needs to be done. So there's no loopholes for any type of abuse there. So yeah, we need to defend human rights to continue sustainable development. So the question number 3 is: you assume that I automatically am inclined to have wealth, power, and prestige. Well, what if I don't? Am I still being subjected to your scope of social classes? Oh, so you're saying that you may be excluded from any classification of social classes, and therefore, oh, you're quite a smart one, so you wouldn't be in the category of any social inequality or marginalization. Well, my answer to that is yes, whether one likes it or not, some of these concepts are succinctly reflected actually in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which according to him reflects in many aspects of one's life. Which I totally agree with. Working for money, studying to increase knowledge, and emulating good character to belong in society are the involuntary conformances we do to unknowingly satisfy these principles. I mean, look at this. Working for money, you work for money to have wealth. Even just a small value is already part of the principle. Studying to increase your knowledge is part of the cultural capital. And emulating good character to belong in society is part of wait, let me see, part of the prestige. Knowledge is power, by the way, in the second example. So these are involuntary conformances that are existing. So what's the best way to combat inequality? That's the fourth question. Well, I don't really have an answer to that. Well, I don't think there's a perfect solution, but I believe it could be education. So through education, we recognize the threat of inequality and how it predisposes to envy and hatred. So instead, we emulate love for others and common understanding to combat this. No one deserves isolation and deliberate violation of one's human rights. So it is imperative that educational systems work hard to hold its purpose as the greatest equalizer of men through the knowledge and character development it bestows. So that's my answer. So as a synthesis and recap, social inequality is the heart of sociology because it allows us to see unnaturalness of some social contracts, to be able to actually criticize them and know what are the strengths and weaknesses of some policies. So we keep questioning because of social inequality. So the acquisition of social status, albeit having fingerprints of ascribed traits, still have mostly to do with achieved traits. So it tells us that you can work and you should work for what you want. And third, your social standing is based on your attainment of certain social desirables and social capitals. And the fourth is social equality is worth fighting for. And the fifth is every social construct is never fixed and natural in the sociological perspective. You can change the world to be better for the next generation. So as you can see, the first three are succinct recaps and the 4 and 5 are synthesis of how you can apply them to your life. No, that's too vague. How you can apply them to your sociological and political mentality and your own social and political faculty for your train of thought. So it's time to test yourself. So I'll be copy pasting this in the description, this link to test what you have learned. Don't worry, I didn't put the Q&As. I didn't put those subjective opinions because my opinions aren't facticities. It's just my opinion. I made this test a bit tricky. Okay, I'll read this. Okay, I'm reading this actually. So I made this test a bit tricky with the terminology. This would test if you accurately remembered each term and not just got the gist of it. Because why did I do this? Because sociology has a lot of exclusive terms, so accuracy is a must. If you aren't planning to be a sociologist, this could ensure that you could comprehend political policy books to enhance your voting credibility. So you need this is an encouragement to work hard for your votes. Work hard for your votes. Election is up around the corner. So this is it. This is the website. I'm not gonna read that long link. So that's the website. So thanks for listening. Hopefully this left an intellectual impression in you. So as again, thanks for watching.